A stranger's smile in a hospital cafeteria changed everything, proving that sometimes the most profound healing happens not through medicine, but through the simple courage to sit beside someone who's carrying the world alone. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but David kept stirring it anyway. Round and round, the plastic spoon made circles in the brown liquid, while his mind wandered to places he didn't want it to go. The hospital cafeteria was busy around him, filled with the usual mix of doctors grabbing quick meals, families whispering over sandwiches, and visitors like himself who seemed lost in their own worlds. He sat in the corner by the big window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. It was Tuesday afternoon, and this had become his routine for the past 3 weeks. Work the night shift as a security guard, sleep for a few hours, then come here to the hospital, visit his father in the ICU, sit in this same spot afterward, staring at nothing. The doctors had been gentle but honest. "His condition is getting worse," they said. "You should prepare yourself." Those words played in his head like a broken record. How do you prepare for losing the only family you have left? David pulled out his phone and immediately regretted it. 17 missed calls from his ex-wife. He knew what those were about. The child support payment he couldn't make last month. The electric bill that bounced. The rent that was already 5 days late. He turned the phone face down on the table and went back to stirring his cold coffee. Around him, life continued. A young nurse laughed with her colleague about weekend plans. A family at a nearby table shared photos on their phone, smiling at whatever memories they were looking at. An elderly couple held hands while eating soup, comfortable in their quiet togetherness. David felt like he was watching everything through thick glass. Present, but separate. There, but not really there. 3 months ago, his life had looked different. He'd been working 2 jobs, slowly catching up on bills, even managing to save a little money. Then his father collapsed at the grocery store. Heart attack, they said. Then complications. Then more complications. Now here they were. The medical bills were piling up faster than David could count them. Insurance covered some things, but not others. Each day brought new forms to fill out, new people to call, new numbers that made his stomach hurt just looking at them. His boss at the security company had been understanding at first, but patience was wearing thin. "You've missed too many shifts," he'd said yesterday. "I need someone I can count on." David understood. Business was business. But understanding didn't make it easier. He looked around the cafeteria again, at all these people who seemed to have their lives figured out. The doctor at the next table was explaining something medical to his colleague, using words David couldn't understand but speaking with confidence. A woman in scrubs was video calling someone, probably her kids, asking about homework and promising to be home soon. Everyone seemed connected to something. Someone. A purpose. A plan. A future that made sense. David felt like he was floating in space, untethered from everything that used to anchor him. His father had always been the steady one, the one with advice, the one who knew what to do when things got difficult. Now their roles were reversed, and David had no idea how to be the strong one. The rain outside was getting heavier. People hurried past the window holding newspapers over their heads or running between buildings, life moving fast while his felt stuck in slow motion. His phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it without picking up the phone. His ex-wife again. "Call me, this can't wait." He knew she was right. The bills couldn't wait. His kids needed things. But he also knew he had nothing good to tell her right now. David rubbed his eyes, feeling tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. When was the last time he'd had a real conversation with someone? Not about medical updates or bill payments or work schedules, but just talking. About normal things. About anything that wasn't falling apart. He missed that. He missed feeling like a regular person with regular problems. He missed looking forward to things instead of dreading them. He missed sleeping through the night without waking up worried about tomorrow. The cafeteria was starting to empty out as the afternoon shift change approached. David knew he should probably head back upstairs to check on his father before the evening visiting hours ended. But sitting here in this neutral space between the outside world and the ICU felt safer somehow. Here he could pretend for a few minutes that he was just someone having coffee. Just a guy taking a break from his day. Not someone whose world was slowly crumbling while he watched helplessly. A cleaning lady came by his table, wiping down the empty chairs with a damp cloth. She smiled at him kindly, the way service workers do when they recognize a regular customer. "You okay today, honey?" she asked, her voice warm with genuine concern. David nodded and managed a small smile back. "Yeah, just taking a break." She moved on to the next table, but her simple kindness stayed with him. It was the first time in weeks someone had asked how he was doing without wanting something from him in return. No forms to sign, no payments to discuss, no updates about test results. Just human concern from one person to another. Maybe that's what he missed most. Being seen as just David, not David the son of the patient or David who owes money or David who can't keep up. Just David, sitting with his cold coffee on a rainy Tuesday, trying to figure out how to keep going when everything felt impossible. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the window. Inside, the cafeteria hummed with quiet activity, and David sat between these two worlds, stirring his coffee and waiting for something to change, though he couldn't say exactly what. David had been sitting in the same spot for 20 minutes, lost in his thoughts when he noticed her. An elderly woman with silver hair pulled back neatly, wearing a soft blue cardigan over a floral dress that looked like it had been carefully pressed that morning. She carried a worn leather purse that had clearly seen many years of use, and she moved through the cafeteria with the careful but determined steps of someone who knew exactly where she was going. What caught his attention wasn't just her appearance but the way she looked around the room. Her eyes moved from table to table, not searching for food or an empty seat, but studying the faces of the people sitting alone. She paused near a young woman who was crying quietly over her untouched salad. She lingered by an older man who sat, hunched over his newspaper, though David could tell he wasn't really reading it. Then her gaze landed on David, and something in her expression softened. She stood there for a moment, just looking at him with eyes that seemed to see more than most people bothered to notice. There was no pity in her look, no awkward curiosity, just a quiet understanding that made David feel suddenly exposed, as if she could see right through the walls he'd built around himself. Without asking permission or even hesitating, she walked directly to his table and sat down in the chair across from him. She placed her purse carefully on the table, folded her hands in front of her, and smiled. It wasn't the polite smile strangers give each other in passing, or the sympathetic smile people offered when they heard about his father. This was different. It was warm and genuine, with little crinkles around her eyes that spoke of a lifetime of real smiles. It was the kind of smile that made you feel like you'd just been welcomed into someone's living room. "You look like someone who could use some company," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "I'm Eleanor." David blinked, caught completely off guard. In 3 weeks of sitting in this same spot, no one had ever approached him like this. People minded their own business in hospitals. They kept to themselves, wrapped up in their own worries and fears. This woman had just broken an unspoken rule, and somehow it didn't feel wrong at all. I'm David," he managed, still trying to process what was happening. Eleanor nodded as if his name was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "It's nice to meet you, David. I hope you don't mind me joining you. I saw you sitting here, and you reminded me of my late husband. He used to get that same look when he was carrying the world on his shoulders." She said it so matter-of-factly, without drama or excessive emotion. Just a simple observation shared between two people who happened to be in the same place at the same time. David didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to politely excuse himself and leave. He wasn't used to talking to strangers, especially not about personal things. But there was something about Eleanor's presence that made leaving feel impossible. She radiated a kind of calm energy that he hadn't felt in months. "The coffee here is terrible," Eleanor said, glancing at his cup with a slight smile. "But I suppose it's not really about the coffee, is it?" She was right, of course. David hadn't even tasted the coffee in weeks. It was just something to hold. something to give his hands a purpose while his mind tried to make sense of everything falling apart around him. "I've been coming here every afternoon for 2 months now," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a conversational tone as if they were old friends catching up. "My sister is upstairs in the cardiac unit, had a massive heart attack while she was gardening. 1 minute she was planting tomatoes, the next minute she was on her way here in an ambulance." She paused to look out the window at the rain, which was still coming down steadily. "Funny how life can change so fast, isn't it? We make all these plans, think we know what tomorrow will bring, and then something happens that changes everything." David found himself nodding. That was exactly how it felt. 3 months ago, he'd been worried about normal things like getting a raise at work or fixing the leak in his bathroom sink. Now those problems seemed laughably small compared to what he was facing. "Is she—" David started, then stopped, not sure if it was appropriate to ask. "Getting better slowly," Eleanor replied, understanding his unfinished question. "The doctors say it's going to be a long road, but she's stubborn, always has been. I think that's going to work in her favor." She turned her attention back to David, those kind eyes studying his face again. "What about you? I'm guessing someone important is upstairs too." David hesitated. He hadn't talked about his father's condition with anyone outside of the medical staff. Even his conversations with his ex-wife were more about logistics and money than actual feelings. But something about Eleanor made him want to open up. "My father," he said quietly. "Heart attack 3 weeks ago. Things aren't looking good." Eleanor nodded slowly, and David could see in her expression that she understood exactly what "things aren't looking good" meant in hospital language. She didn't offer empty reassurances or tell him everything would be okay. She just acknowledged his pain with a simple nod. "It's hard," she said. "Sitting with someone you love when they're fighting for their life. Makes you feel helpless." "Yeah," David said, surprised by how much relief he felt at hearing someone put it into words. "Exactly." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the rain streak down the window. The cafeteria continued, its usual rhythm around them, but somehow their corner felt separate from all of it, protected almost. "You know what I've learned in my 78 years?" Eleanor said eventually. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is just show up. Just be present, even when we don't know what to say or how to help." She reached across the table and patted David's hand gently. Her skin was soft and warm, and the simple touch conveyed more comfort than any words could have. "Your father knows you're here," she said. "That matters more than you might think." The next day, David found himself looking at the clock more often than usual during his shift. By 1:30 in the afternoon, he was already thinking about the cafeteria. Would Eleanor be there again? Had yesterday been just a random moment of kindness, or something more? When he walked into the cafeteria at 2:15, his eyes immediately went to their table by the window. Empty. His heart sank a little, though he told himself it was silly to be disappointed. Why would a stranger change her routine just because they'd had one conversation? He got his coffee and sat down anyway in the same chair he'd occupied yesterday. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was trying to break through the clouds. He watched people come and go, but his mind kept wandering back to Eleanor's gentle smile and the way she'd made him feel less alone in his worry. At exactly 2:30, she appeared. Eleanor walked through the cafeteria with that same purposeful stride, carrying her worn leather purse and wearing a different floral dress, this one in shades of green. When she spotted David, her face lit up with genuine pleasure, as if seeing an old friend after a long absence. "There you are," she said, settling into the same chair she'd chosen yesterday. "I was hoping you'd be here." David felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. Someone was hoping to see him. When was the last time that had happened? "How's your father today?" Eleanor asked, and David could tell she really wanted to know. She wasn't just making polite conversation. "About the same," David replied. "The nurses say he had a better night, but—" He trailed off, not wanting to voice his fears. "But you're afraid to hope," Eleanor finished for him. I understand that feeling. She opened her purse and pulled out a small packet of crackers, the kind they give away at soup kitchens. Hospital food, she said with a slight smile. I've learned to come prepared. They shared the crackers, and Eleanor began to talk about her sister. Angela has always been the fighter in our family, she said. When we were kids during the war, she once stood up to 3 boys who were picking on our little brother. She was only 8 years old, but she had this fierce look in her eyes. That same look is still there now, even when she's sleeping. Eleanor's voice carried a mixture of love and admiration as she spoke about her sister. After the war, when things were really tough, Angela worked 3 jobs to help support our family. She'd come home exhausted every night, but she'd still help us kids with our homework. Never complained, not once. David found himself leaning forward, drawn into her stories. What kind of jobs? He asked. Cleaning offices at night, working, in a factory during the day, and on weekends she'd help at the local bakery. She'd come home smelling like bread and soap, and she'd always have these little treats for us that the baker let her take home. Eleanor paused, her eyes growing distant. She never got married, you know. Said she was too busy taking care of everyone else to think about herself. I used to worry about that, but now I think she was exactly who she was meant to be. She's touched more lives than most people ever will. As the days passed, this became their routine. David would finish his morning visit with his father, grab coffee, and wait for Eleanor at 2:30. She never failed to appear, always with that same warm smile and genuine interest in how his day was going. Gradually, their conversations deepened. Eleanor shared stories from her own life that seemed to come from a different world entirely. She'd lived through rationing during the war, the excitement of the moon landing, the social changes of the 60s and 70s. She'd raised 4 children mostly on her own after her husband passed away young, working as a seamstress to make ends meet. I remember one Christmas, she told David one afternoon, when I had exactly $12 to spend on presents for 4 kids. I was sitting at my kitchen table trying to figure out how to make it work when my neighbor knocked on the door. She had this bag of fabric scraps from her job at the clothing factory. Said she thought I might be able to use them. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with the memory. I stayed up 3 nights straight making little dolls and toy cars out of those scraps. Come Christmas morning, you would have thought I'd given those children diamonds. They played with those homemade toys for years. David shared his own stories too, though they felt smaller somehow compared to Eleanor's rich history. He told her about his father's work as a mechanic, how he'd taught David to fix cars in their garage on weekends, about the time they'd driven across 3 states to see a baseball game, just because David's favorite player was making his final appearance. Your father sounds like a good man, Eleanor said after one of these stories. The kind who shows love through actions rather than words. That observation hit David in a way he hadn't expected. It was true. His father had never been much for emotional conversations or grand gestures, but he'd always been there, always reliable, always steady. Until now. I keep thinking I should be doing more, David admitted one day. The doctors and nurses, they're actually helping him. I just sit there. Eleanor looked at him with those wise eyes. You know, when my husband was dying, I felt the same way. All these medical professionals coming and going, doing important things. And there I was just holding his hand. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But after he passed, the doctor told me something I'll never forget. He said that in all his years of medicine, he'd learned that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about not being broken alone. David felt tears prick at his eyes. He'd been so focused on feeling useless that he'd never considered that his presence might actually matter. Your father may not be able to tell you, Eleanor continued gently, but somewhere deep down he knows you're there. He knows he's not alone. That's not nothing, David. That's everything. On their 6th meeting, Eleanor arrived looking tired. Her usual bright energy was subdued, and David noticed the way she gripped her purse a little tighter than usual. Rough day? He asked. Eleanor nodded. Angela had some complications last night. Nothing life-threatening, but it was scary for a while. Made me realize how much I've been counting on her getting better. For the first time since they'd been meeting, Eleanor looked vulnerable. The roles reversed, and David found himself wanting to comfort her the way she'd been comforting him. "She's lucky to have you," he said. "Someone who shows up every single day, who believes in her recovery even when things get scary." Eleanor smiled, but it was a smaller smile than usual. "Sometimes, I wonder if I'm visiting her or visiting myself. Does that make sense?" David nodded. "I think maybe we're all just trying not to feel alone in this." They sat quietly for a while, two people who'd found an unexpected friendship in the midst of their separate struggles. Around them, the cafeteria hummed with its usual activity, but their corner by the window had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where they could share their fears and hopes with someone who truly understood. 2 weeks had passed since that first day when Eleanor sat down across from David, and he was starting to understand something important about her smile. It wasn't the fake cheerfulness people sometimes put on when they don't know what else to do. It wasn't denial or pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Eleanor's smile was something deeper, something that came from a place David was only beginning to recognize. He saw it most clearly on the day she introduced him to Rosa, a young mother who had been sitting alone at a corner table for 3 days straight. Rosa looked exhausted, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her clothes wrinkled like she'd been sleeping in them. She stared at her phone constantly, occasionally wiping away tears she thought no one would notice. Eleanor had been watching Rosa the same way she'd watched David that first day, with those careful, understanding eyes. On Thursday afternoon, she simply stood up from their usual table and walked over to where Rosa sat. "Excuse me, dear," Eleanor said gently. "I couldn't help but notice you've been here every day this week. I'm Eleanor, and that's my friend David. Over there. We meet here every afternoon around this time. Would you like to join us?" Rosa looked up, surprised. Her eyes were red-rimmed and uncertain. "I don't want to bother anyone," she said quietly. "You wouldn't be bothering us at all," Eleanor replied with that same warm smile David had come to know so well. Sometimes it helps to sit with people who understand. That's how David learned about Rosa's 2-year-old son who was upstairs fighting. A rare form of childhood cancer. Rosa worked as a translator for a legal firm, but she'd exhausted all her sick days and vacation time. She was terrified of losing her job, but she couldn't bear to leave the hospital for more than a few hours at a time. Eleanor listened to Rosa's story with the same gentle attention she'd given David's, asking thoughtful questions and offering practical suggestions. When Rosa mentioned struggling with the medical forms because some were in English and others in Spanish, David quietly offered to help translate anything she needed. "You speak Spanish?" Rosa asked, looking surprised. "My grandmother only spoke Spanish," David explained. "My father made sure I learned both languages growing up, said it would open more doors for me." As Rosa's shoulders relaxed and she began to talk more freely, David watched Eleanor's face. There was something in her expression that went beyond simple kindness. She wasn't just being nice to a stranger. She was creating connection where none had existed before. She was building a bridge between Rosa's isolation and the possibility of community. The next week, Eleanor expanded their little group again. Frank was an elderly man who came to the cafeteria every day at lunchtime, always carrying a small bouquet of flowers from the hospital gift shop. He'd been visiting his wife of 62 years, who had dementia and no longer recognized him. Eleanor spotted him sitting alone, methodically eating a sandwich while staring at nothing. "Frank," Eleanor said, approaching his table with that same gentle confidence. "I'm Eleanor. I've seen you here with those beautiful flowers every day. Your wife must be very special." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "She doesn't know who I am anymore," he said quietly. "But I keep bringing her flowers anyway. She always loved daisies." Eleanor sat down next to him. "Tell me about her," she said simply. For the next hour, Frank talked about his wife, how they'd met at a church dance in 1962, how she'd taught elementary school for 30 years and remembered every single student's name, how she'd sung lullabies to their children and later to their grandchildren, how she'd made the best apple pie in 3 counties and always insisted on bringing dessert to every family gathering. David and Rosa listened too, and gradually Frank's sadness transformed into something lighter as he shared these precious memories. By the end of the conversation, he was actually smiling. "You know what?" Frank said, looking at Eleanor with genuine gratitude. "I haven't talked about the good times in months. I'd almost forgotten there were so many good times." This became Eleanor's gift, David realized. She didn't try to fix people's problems or offer solutions to things that couldn't be solved. Instead, she helped people remember they were still human beings with stories worth telling, even in the middle of their worst moments. Their little group began meeting every day at 2:30. Sometimes it was just David and Eleanor. Sometimes Rosa would join them with updates about her son's treatment. Frank became a regular, often staying after his morning visit with his wife to share lunch with them. Other people started noticing their corner table. A teenage girl whose grandfather was recovering from surgery. A middle-aged man whose mother had broken her hip. A college student whose roommate had been in a car accident. Eleanor welcomed each new person with the same open warmth, making room. At their table and in their conversations, David began to understand that Eleanor's daily smile wasn't something that happened to her. It was something she chose deliberately and consciously every single day. She had her own fears and sadness and moments of despair, but she made a decision each morning to show up as someone who could carry a little bit of other people's burdens. "How do you do it?" David asked her one afternoon after a particularly difficult day. His father had taken a turn for the worse that morning, and David felt like he was barely holding himself together. "How do you keep smiling when everything feels so hard?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the parking lot where families came and went, carrying their own loads of worry and hope. "My grandmother used to say that we have two choices every morning," she finally said. "We can wake up and add to the sadness in the world, or we can wake up and try to add a little light." She said the world has plenty of sadness already, but it can always use more light. She turned to look at David with those wise, kind eyes. "I'm not happy all the time. I cry at night sometimes, when I'm alone and thinking about Angela. I worry about things I can't control. But I've learned that my pain doesn't have to become someone else's pain. And maybe, if I'm really lucky, my hope can become someone else's hope." David thought about this as he watched Eleanor interact with their growing group of cafeteria friends. She remembered details about everyone's situation. She asked follow-up questions about things people had mentioned days before. She celebrated small victories and offered comfort during setbacks. But most importantly, she helped each person feel seen and valued, not as patients, families, or visitors, or people defined by their current crisis, but as complete human beings, worthy of attention and care. That afternoon, as David prepared to go upstairs for evening visiting hours, he realized something had changed in him too. For the first time in weeks, he felt ready to sit with his father, not just as someone waiting for bad news, but as someone carrying a little bit of the light Eleanor had shared with him. David's father passed away on a Thursday morning in early spring, just as the first flowers were beginning to bloom in the hospital courtyard. It happened peacefully, with David holding his hand and whispering stories about their fishing trips from years past. The doctor said his father's heart simply got too tired to keep going, but that he wasn't in pain at the end. The grief hit David like a physical blow, even though he'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. All the conversations with Eleanor, all the gentle wisdom about presence and love, couldn't quite cushion the reality of loss. He sat in that hospital room for a long time after the nurses had finished their work, not ready to leave his father behind or step into a world where he no longer existed. When he finally made his way down to the cafeteria, it was well past their usual meeting time. He didn't expect to find anyone there, but Eleanor was sitting at their table by the window, her hands folded patiently as if she'd been waiting all day. She looked up when she saw him, and her face immediately reflected his pain. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She simply stood up and wrapped him in the kind of hug that said everything words couldn't express. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and David felt tears he'd been holding back finally break free. They sat together for over an hour, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in the comfortable silence they'd learned to share. Eleanor told him about her husband's final days, how strange and empty the house had felt afterward, how she'd continued setting two places at the dinner table for weeks before she could break the habit. "It takes time to learn how to live with the space they leave behind," she said gently. "But that space isn't emptiness, David. It's all the love you shared, and that never really goes away." 3 days later, at the funeral, David was surprised to see familiar faces in the back rows of the chapel. Eleanor was there, of course, wearing a simple black dress and sitting quietly with her hands folded. But Rosa had come too, and Frank, and several others from their cafeteria group. They didn't intrude on the family's grief, but their presence spoke volumes about the connections that had been formed over those weeks of shared coffee and conversation. After the service, Eleanor approached David with a gentle hug and whispered, "Your father was so lucky to have you with him. He never had to face any of this alone." The words stayed with David through the difficult weeks that followed, dealing with paperwork and legal matters, clearing out his father's apartment, learning to navigate a world where he was truly on his own for the first time in his life. The grief was overwhelming some days, but it was different from the desperate isolation he'd felt during those first weeks at the hospital. 2 months after the funeral, David found himself back at the hospital, not as a visitor this time, but as a volunteer. He'd approached the patient services director with an idea that had been growing in his mind since Eleanor first sat down beside him. "I want to start a support group," he'd explained, "for people who are spending long hours here with sick family members, just a place where they can sit together and not feel so alone." The director had been enthusiastic about the idea. They gave him a small conference room that wasn't being used in the afternoons, and David began spreading the word. He made simple flyers and posted them around the cafeteria and waiting areas. "Coffee and conversation," they said, "for families and friends of patients, every Tuesday and Thursday at 3 p.m. The first meeting had only 3 people, but word spread quickly. Within a month, David was regularly hosting 15 to 20 people, all dealing with their own versions of the fear and uncertainty he'd experienced. Eleanor came to the meetings sometimes, even though her sister had recovered enough to go home. She'd sit quietly in the circle, offering the same gentle wisdom and careful attention that had first drawn David to her. She helped newcomers feel welcome, and reminded everyone that healing happened in many different ways. "You know," she told the group one afternoon, "I used to think helping people meant fixing their problems. But I've learned that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply witness each other's struggles. When someone else really sees your pain and sits with you in it, you realize you're not carrying it alone anymore." David watched as others in the group nodded in recognition. He saw the same transformation that had happened in him beginning to happen in others. People who had arrived looking lost and frightened gradually became sources of support for newer members. The scared became the comforters, the lost became the guides. Rosa, whose son had successfully completed his treatment, now volunteered as a translator for Spanish-speaking families. Frank started bringing flowers not just for his wife, but for other patients who didn't have visitors. The teenage girl whose grandfather had recovered began reading to children in the pediatric ward. One afternoon, about 6 months after his father's death, David was setting up chairs for a meeting when Eleanor arrived early. She watched him arrange the circle, that familiar smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You know what I see when I look at this room," she said. "What's that?" David asked. "I see your father," she replied gently. "I see the man who taught you that love shows itself through actions. I see the values he passed down to you, living on in a completely new way." David paused in his chair arranging, struck by the truth of her observation. His father had never been one for big emotional gestures or lengthy conversations about feelings. But he'd shown love through reliability, through presence, through simply being there when he was needed. And now David was doing the same thing, in his own way, for people who needed someone to be present with them in their darkest moments. The meetings continued to grow. The hospital administration was so impressed with the program's success that they asked David to help train volunteers at other hospitals in the area. He began speaking at conferences about the power of peer support and the importance of addressing not just medical needs, but emotional ones as well. But the moment that meant the most to David came almost a year after that first day when Eleanor had sat down beside him. A young man named Carlos had been attending meetings for several weeks, dealing with his mother's long battle with diabetes complications. Carlos was quiet and withdrawn, sitting in the circle but rarely participating in the discussions. One Thursday afternoon, David noticed Carlos wasn't in his usual spot. After the meeting ended, he found him in the cafeteria, sitting alone at a corner table with an untouched cup of coffee, staring out the window with that same lost expression David remembered from his own dark days. Without hesitation, David walked over and sat down across from Carlos. He didn't ask permission or offer explanations. He simply smiled, the same warm, understanding smile Eleanor had given him all those months ago. "You look like someone who could use some company," David said. Gently, Carlos looked up, surprise flickering across his face. Then slowly his tense shoulders began to relax. "I'd like that," Carlos said quietly. As they began to talk, David felt Eleanor's presence in the conversation, even though she wasn't physically there. Her wisdom lived on in the questions he asked, the way he listened without judgment, the gentle space he created for Carlos to share his fears and frustrations. Later that evening, as David walked to his car, he thought about the ripple effects of kindness. Eleanor had sat down beside a stranger and offered her presence. That simple act had not only changed David's life, but had created something that was now touching dozens of other lives. Her smile, her willingness to connect, her belief in the power of human companionship had become a legacy that would continue long after any of them were gone. David realized that this was perhaps the most beautiful thing about Eleanor's gift. It wasn't something she kept to herself or used up by giving it away. Instead, it multiplied every time someone chose to sit down beside a stranger, every time someone offered presence instead of solutions, every time someone remembered that we all need to know we're not alone in our struggles. Eleanor had taught him that healing wasn't always about fixing what was broken. Sometimes it was simply about choosing not to let others be broken alone. And in learning to carry that light for others, David had discovered that grief and joy could coexist, that loss could lead to purpose, and that the love we share never really disappears. It just finds new ways to shine.